Hello, I'm Yousef Munayyer, head of the Palestine-Israel program and senior fellow here at Arab Center, Washington, D.C., and your podcast host.
Hi, I'm Dr. Yara M. I'm an assistant professor of global health management and informatics and a non-resident fellow at the Arab Center.
Hey, hi, I'm Rami Khouri. I'm just coming up on almost 60 years of journalism covering and analyzing the Middle East, now associated with the American University of Beirut and the Arab Center, Washington.
Hi, I'm Hanna Alshaikh. I'm the Palestine Project Coordinator at Arab Center, Washington, and I'm also a PhD candidate in History and Middle Eastern Studies at Harvard University.
Well, I want to welcome you all back for another Hiwar episode to our participants here and to our guests who are tuning in. Hiwar, of course, is the Arabic word for dialogue or discussion. And in each of these episodes, we are going to be talking about some of the big issues of the day. Last time we spoke, we touched on the meeting between President Trump and the visiting King of Jordan who came to Washington, D.C. We talked about progress in the ceasefire talks, reconstruction plans, the role of the Arab states today, and the latest on what was taking place in the West Bank. And since then, there has been a number of different developments, including really the end of what we were able to call a ceasefire period. Even though during that ceasefire period, as we know, Israeli fire surely didn't cease, as over 150 Palestinians were killed in the nearly 2 months of that ceasefire in Gaza alone. But of course, since then, the Israelis have effectively shattered the ceasefire with a major escalation in the bombing. Yara, can we start with you and maybe kind of bring us up to speed on what took place and has been evolving over the last several days as the Israelis have shattered the ceasefire agreement that took so long and so much work to kind of bring into effect?
Yeah, absolutely, Yousef. And I want to first start by echoing your sentiment that this was never a genuine ceasefire, as these things tend to not be, as we continually still saw Israeli bombing and killing of Palestinians throughout the Gaza Strip. But it was a period of less bombing, people able to return to their homes if their homes were still there, more aid getting in, even if it was inadequate. And we saw kind of all of that, even very fragile respite, falling apart after March 18th. So somehow, since then, it's become even worse than before. We have the reinstated siege imposed by the Israelis that has been absolutely devastating to aid and relief efforts. We're hearing from many hospitals and people who distribute aid in Gaza that they've gotten nothing for weeks, that they've actually never seen such few goods coming in. So that's going to become a major catastrophe if it hasn't already in certain pockets: lack of food, lack of medical supplies, lack of power. We're seeing an escalation of what appear to be targeted killings. We've had at least 8 aid workers who have been killed since the ceasefire ended. We've had the high-profile murder of several journalists in Gaza. We've had escalating raids and attacks on first responders. So the Palestinian Red Crescent has responded and reported that many of their teams that have been dispersed have been kidnapped, detained. They don't know where they are. They're not able to get in touch with them. Communication has been lost. Just since March 18th, an additional 142,000 Palestinians have been displaced. And this is not the situation that it was a year ago. There is very little shelter left, very few homes left, very few hospitals left. So when we're talking about people moving around now and sites getting bombed, there's very little to bomb and there's very little places for people to go. So now we're just seeing destruction on top of destruction with this added layer of almost no humanitarian intervention possible. In fact, we had the UN Secretary General saying that essentially the UN would have to he made it clear that it was not cease efforts, but greatly reduce their footprint on the ground in Gaza, simply because there's not much they can do. It's very difficult to travel. They're not getting aid in. We saw the Israeli military just 2 days after they broke the ceasefire redeploying to the Netzarim corridor and redividing the Gaza Strip between the north and the south again. We've seen since March 18th, at least 800 Palestinians have been killed, 1,700 injured. This adds to the already more than 50,000 who have been killed, and again, likely many more. They were still uncovering bodies that were under the rubble from months ago during the ceasefire and currently. So we still don't really have a good sense of the death toll, but it's going up again. That includes what UNICEF says is the single most deadly day for children period, with over 180 Palestinian children killed on March 18th. So we are in a very, very perilous situation. And then there's like the kind of individual cases. Shortly before the ceasefire was announced, there was the kidnapping of Dr. Hassam Abu Safiya from Kamal Adwan Hospital. We've since heard from the Israelis that his detention has been arbitrarily extended another 6 months. He's been unable to speak regularly to his lawyers and family. So we're seeing Israel, instead of relenting on some of these issues, digging in, and now they're holding people for longer in situations where they're unable to reach people. Israel has, aside from bombing and damaging almost every hospital in Gaza, they're now bombing the few hospitals that were left standing. So, for example, the Turkish hospital in the north, which was deemed non-functional shortly after October 7th because of lack of fuel, and it's the only specialized cancer hospital in the Gaza Strip, has now been entirely destroyed. So the Israelis are making it even more difficult for any kind of efforts of Palestinians trying to return or rebuild after that by bombing what little is left. And all of this is happening at the same time we're seeing escalating genocidal language from Israeli politicians and policymakers, and an escalating wave of violence, repression, restriction imposed by the Israeli military and settlers in the West Bank. So we're kind of seeing the worst of what has already been a horrific situation, and we're seeing less media attention on it than we did initially. It's been completely normalized now. And in fact, we're seeing more repression of those voices who are attempting to criticize Israel for what it's doing. And I know we'll touch on that later in our conversation.
Yeah, thank you for all that, Yara. I just want to tease out a couple of the things that you talked through, because I think they're important. I mean, one of the things that happened during the sort of the ceasefire period, and again, we already talked about how that wasn't really a ceasefire, but still more stable than what we saw during the highest levels of violence, is that people moved around. People moved around from areas that were called safe areas, although we know that they're not safe areas. They were regularly targeted. But we had a lot of movement of internally displaced people. There were images of thousands upon thousands of people coming back into the north of Gaza. And I think one thing to keep in mind as this genocidal level of violence has returned now with these strikes is that people are all over the strip again, in very vulnerable ways, and that is a little bit different than what was going on prior to the ceasefire, and it might have something to do with the how vulnerable people are, and the horrific number of children that we saw killed in that initial sort of wave of Israeli strikes. Many of those strikes, coming on tents or structures that are barely even standing. So that's one thing. And the other piece that I wanted to emphasize, as you noted, Dr. Abu Safiya, he had his detention extended, and I think this is worth explaining a little bit for folks who don't quite understand how this happens, and it happens a lot. And that's basically that the Israeli military can detain somebody, make claims against them, and then hold them indefinitely without charge or trial. And then these periods are effectively reapproved on end by military courts who do not need to review evidence and function as a rubber stamp for the military over and over again. So Dr. Abu Safia, of course, was a doctor working in Gaza, was, in one of the most difficult areas that were targeted over and over again, was ultimately arrested when there was an attack on Kamal Adwan Hospital, and he was never charged. And he is, of course, among thousands of Palestinians that are held in what is called administrative detention, oftentimes indefinitely, and are never charged. And oftentimes these folks are ultimately released after months, sometimes years, never having been charged, never having had an opportunity to defend themselves in court. So I just wanted to tease both of those things out. And Yara, I know you have something to chime in here with, and I want to invite Rami and Hanna to join in on these points as well.
Yeah, thanks, Yousef. I mean, Dr. Abu Safia has gotten some global attention because of his position, but as you note, administrative detentions happen all the time to Palestinians, including children. And just to add a dystopian note to what you've already said, the Israelis claim it's not even with no evidence. They claim they have evidence. It's secret evidence. His lawyer, as do the lawyers of many administrative detainees, requests the evidence so that they can, build a case, right? And the Israeli courts say they're not entitled to the evidence. So it builds this facade of we're just going through these legal processes, and yet it's entirely built to continue the system, because their claim is not we have no evidence he's a terrorist. It's worse than that. It's we have evidence he is a terrorist, so that they can go around and tell people that he's deserving of this treatment, and yet they don't share that evidence. And again, this has been the case with hundreds, if not thousands, of cases for Palestinians held over the many decades. And as you noted, many of these people are then quietly released with no charges. So, and especially when a group like an international group or a human rights group intervenes, these people are often released, perhaps many years after their detention. So it's even more twisted in some ways, and it makes the case for him to be released that people have been calling for around the world even more difficult, because Israel is insisting that this is appropriate.
And I just realized one dimension we should add to this is that you're right. They claim to have evidence. Right? They never share that evidence. They're not required to reveal it. And, despite that, they get to hold the person indefinitely, and they never charge them. So you think if they have evidence, you could easily make a charge and convict this person. But what ends up happening instead is these people languish in detention in horrific conditions. And oftentimes what happens is, in conversations with their lawyers, they end up agreeing to sometimes sign confessions so that they can ultimately have a timeline for release. And it's one of the reasons why military courts, the Israeli military courts, has something like a 97% conviction rate. Not because you have to actually present evidence and convict these people, but you can effectively hold them in detention indefinitely in horrific, torturous conditions and coerce confessions to be signed from people who see no other path out of these Israeli dungeons. So I just wanted to kind of include that, because it is a Palestinian story that is so common for many Palestinians who have been through the Israeli military system.
Yeah, if I can add a couple of quick points to that, what Yara said about the evidence. What we've seen in the last 18 months is that the Israelis will make up evidence. They'll make accusations that later, when the press in Israel or the Western countries or Palestinians, when they investigate it, turns out to be not true. So they'll fabricate evidence. That's probably one reason why they don't want to show it, because it's not real evidence. Two quick points I would add to what Yara said, or put it in a broader context. One, the terrible things that the Israelis are doing, they have been doing to a smaller degree, a lesser degree, really since the 1940s, since the early 1940s, killing Palestinians, driving them out, torturing them, etc., taking their lands. So this is a continuation of a long settler, colonial, imperial, apartheid kind of process. And it's just so much more evident now because it's reached such a gruesome, barbaric degree. The second point is that astoundingly, to me at least astoundingly, almost everything that Israel has done, all these terrible things, is not only acquiesced in by most Western countries, but often enthusiastically supported and funded and diplomatically protected and provided with the armaments to get it done. So what we're dealing with here, really, I think we've reached the point now where we have to admit what we're dealing with is a continuation and an aggravation of the colonial imperial assault on Palestine that Zionism started in the 1920s. The British and then the Americans and others came in. And this is now reaching a kind of a high watermark. And the world still, the Western world, which has the power to intervene, still just watches it and doesn't do anything. So we have to just assume that this is what the US and UK and Germany and other countries really want to happen. And we have to stop appealing to them to please, apply your laws, etc. This is a big challenge to the Palestinians and all their supporters. And how do we get out of this terrible situation?
One thing I'd add to is that a 16-year-old Palestinian, a minor, died in Israeli military detention this week. There are reports that he was tortured in captivity, and I use the word captivity very deliberately. It is systematic practice that the Israeli military often raids Palestinian homes and arrests Palestinian minors in the middle of the night. They're often zip-tied, subjected to torture, beatings, interrogation and questioning without the presence of a parent or a lawyer. These raids in which Palestinian children are arrested typically affect children who are adolescents and in their teenage years, but there are actually recorded cases of children as young as 5 years old being arrested and taken into this. And so, like Yousef had mentioned, the military conviction rate, or the conviction rate in Israeli military courts, is sometimes as close as 99%. It is often the case that Palestinian minors sign forced confessions in Hebrew, which is a language they don't speak or understand, and very few minors could read legal documents and be able to make a decision. And then this follows them around for the rest of their lives. It's often the case that children then have PTSD as a result of their captivity and their time there. But it completely limits their options in life moving forward when it comes to applying to universities, seeking travel internationally. So not only are you stateless and punished for your statelessness, and you're under occupation and punished for living under occupation, but also you are treated as a criminal for something that was done to you, a crime that was done to you as a child. And so I think this is yet another dimension that we have to think about, and it connects to these bigger cases that we're talking about when we look at the kidnapping, really, of Palestinian doctors and Palestinians from Gaza as well.
And I want to stay with you for a moment, because before this return of the genocidal level of violence that we are seeing now again, there were talks about a potential continuation of the ceasefire, of some new deal that the Americans were apparently trying to broker. Can you talk us through that? What was going on? What were the different sides proposing, talking about? How did things break down?
Absolutely. So I think because the narrative has become so convoluted and it's become quite difficult to follow the details of this, I thought it would be helpful to share a quick rundown of what has happened so far since the ceasefire has been agreed upon, or the initial ceasefire was agreed upon at the beginning of phase 1, to help us understand where things are right now. So very quickly, on January 19th, there is a ceasefire agreement reached, which was meant to be a 42-day, what is called the cessation of hostilities, in which prisoners and hostages were exchanged. Israel was to withdraw from key sites within Gaza and densely populated areas. By January 21st, the negotiators, meaning Cairo, the US, and Egypt, Qatar, the US, and Egypt, announced that they're setting up a communications hub in Cairo to help coordinate ceasefire talks, but also monitor the developments to make sure that all sides were adhering to the ceasefire. By February 27th, we see that Egypt had announced the beginning of negotiations for phase 2 of the ceasefire, which was incredibly thorny on the Israeli side, and we'll get into that in a little bit shortly. But the idea was to talk about further prisoner exchanges and a permanent truce. By March 1st, the first phase of the ceasefire, those 42 days, had expired. And in response, Israel intensifies its blockade on aid, like Yara had covered for us in such important detail. And so Israel completely cuts off the entrance of this aid, and it cites Hamas's cessation of hostage releases as the reason for this. But Israel had already been reneging on its deals to allow, or on its agreement to allow humanitarian aid to enter the Strip in that 42-day period as well. So that's something important to keep in mind. Now, by March 9th, this is where things get incredibly tricky. Israel was supposed to send its delegation to Doha to engage in these second phase talks. But what happens is that Israel really is clear that it's refusing to move on to the second phase and is not serious about this at all, despite heavy pressure from mediators and from domestic voices within Israel. They say that they're only going to engage in these talks to talk about phase 1 of the ceasefire. And here they want phase 1 to involve the exchange of 25 hostages for 1,800 Palestinian prisoners and a pause in the fighting. They want this phase to go on until mid-April rather than move into phase 2. And phase 2 would entail a full military withdrawal from Gaza. Now, Hamas refused this and said that they want to move on to phase 2, as was agreed upon previously. They want this full withdrawal from Gaza. They want the unrestricted entrance of humanitarian aid. They want hostages and prisoners to continue to be exchanged on both sides. And they said, and they really emphasized that this had already been agreed upon. Now, the problem is that Israel's offer here really undermines what was agreed upon by all parties in January 19th, right? According to Hamas, Osama Hamdan emphasized this in a media tour that he had been doing around this time. And the tight blockade had really worsened humanitarian conditions in Gaza. What becomes very, very clear as we get closer to this date and this point in the timeline is that so much of Netanyahu's decisions around this time really seem to be linked to Israeli domestic concerns that have nothing to do with the war itself or debates about the war itself. He was courting figures in his right-wing coalition to return, like Itamar Ben-Gvir. There was progress being made on a controversial and massive budget, which ultimately did pass around this time. But was controversial, and this massive budget does include funding for the war itself. And I think Yousef, will like to talk about this some more. But also, there was serious condemnation of what was being described as judicial overreach within Israel, with the dismissal of the head of the Shin Bet and the threatened dismissal of the Attorney General as well, that caused the president of Tel Aviv University to threaten a university strike. And this is back in the news today. But this just paints a picture that, there are many who observe that Netanyahu tends to, use this sort of this form of leverage, which is resuming the war in Gaza, to relieve himself of domestic pressure whenever that happens. And that's why these ceasefire talks really seem to be in limbo. There's no seriousness about moving to the more advanced stages because then he loses this leverage over his own population. It's not just for him about Gaza itself. And so what are the lessons here, really? It's that Netanyahu is using, and the state of Israel itself is using negotiations here to buy itself time and to create and to leave its options open, to manage the situation in Gaza, to keep a war going when it's convenient, but then also, play the game and conduct ceasefire negotiations when it can no longer avoid them. And so by March 12th, we see mediators in Qatar focusing on securing the release of half of the remaining hostages left in Gaza. By March 17th, we see the progress in ceasefire talks really stall. By March 18th, we see the ceasefire completely collapse. And so what seemed to be on the verge of happening around March 9th finally happens around this time. There were extensive air raids across Gaza. 400 people were killed in a very, very short period of time. Something like 1/3 of them were children. And From here, we see that around March 24th, that Egypt then proposes a new initiative to reinstate the ceasefire in Gaza. They're putting forward that Hamas could release 5 hostages per week, and then this would lead to the gradual but full Israeli military withdrawal, backed by U.S. guarantees. Hamas said that they would study this proposal, and Israel has not yet responded. And this pretty much brings us to where we are right now. The Gaza Strip is still being bombarded, and we have yet to see any hope that there could be a serious resumption of the ceasefire and the full, the completion of the 3-phase ceasefire plan that the parties had agreed to before the January 19th ceasefire.
Thank you for that breakdown, Hanna. One of the things that were being discussed during that ceasefire period is, the question of reconstruction in Gaza and how to transition from phase 1, which is the phase that started off the ceasefire, to phase 2 and 3, which were supposed to, of course, bring a permanent end to the war. And begin a period of reconstruction. And embedded in all of that were not just questions about reconstruction and the financing of it, but also the mechanisms through which that reconstruction would take place. And of course, the political context in which that would take place. Now, Donald Trump put forward his plan, allegedly, early on, where he said he, was going to take ownership of the Gaza Strip, and that the population of Gaza was going to be pushed out in some way, and then Gaza was going to turn into a American Riviera on the Mediterranean. Obviously, this was rejected by pretty much everybody with a functioning brain between both of their ears around the world, with the exception of some folks in Israel and some of Trump's strongest supporters here in the United States. But otherwise, most people found it to be dead on arrival. And when the Jordanian king was meeting with Donald Trump after he put forward these plans, the king of Jordan said, well, we're going to see what the Egyptians come up with. And there was a lot of diplomatic engagement between the Arab countries, and ultimately an Arab League meeting around putting forward a sort of Arab alternative to Trump's Riviera plan. And that took place. That was released. Rami, I wanted to ask you to talk us through what that was, where it's gone since then, and maybe if you can just say something about the prospects of it.
Sure. I'd like to just add to one more thing to what Hanna said, which is that the role of the U.S. as the mediator and the guarantor in the ceasefire process is not very serious. I mean, you can't take the U.S. seriously as a mediator or a guarantor when it is the main armorer and defender of Israel. And Trump comes out openly and says, go ahead, do what you want, Israel, and we're with you, and get it done. So this is one of the structural flaws that's been there. And it's also in the Lebanon ceasefire situation where the U.S. is supposed to do that, just to add a little complicating factor. But on terms of the Egyptian proposal, like most things that come out of Egypt, it's grandiose, it's treated with great respect and deference, mainly because of the 3,000 years of Egyptian culture and heritage. But it's not very practical in terms of logistics and political realities. The Egyptians used to be a powerful diplomatic actor in the Middle East. They're not anymore, unfortunately. But the plan was, on paper, sounded great. It was, and also it was presented as a urgent alternative to the Trump Riviera plan. So it was put together pretty quickly, but it immediately ran into huge problems, which are structural problems within the Middle East. For instance, or within Palestine, Hamas and the Palestinian Authority not agreeing who would play a role in Gaza. And then there were problems that the Israelis and the Americans immediately rejected the Egyptian plan and said, this isn't going to work and we're not going to take it seriously. One of the problems was that it required Hamas to give up its arms or even leave the territory, which Hamas wouldn't do. Hamas did say it will not necessarily have to play a role in governance if a governing system is agreed upon by the Palestinians and is legitimate and supported by the Arab world. And then you had the internal Arab conflicts, because you had people like the UAE, which is not very keen on having Hamas play a role, and they want their own men in Fatah to play a bigger role. So there were huge structural impediments to this idea, and of course it's gotten nowhere because it wasn't really well prepared. They didn't lay the groundwork for it. They didn't consult with people, but it remains the only alternative for the moment, and it really needs a serious effort by pan-Arab diplomacy. Probably has to be led by the Saudis to really push this forward and make the adjustments that need to be made. Hamas, fascinatingly, has made it known through the negotiations of the ceasefire and through discussing what's to come later in Palestine and Gaza. They've made it known that they're willing to be pragmatic, that they'll make concessions, but they will not make them unilaterally. They will only turn over their arms to a Palestinian government and defense force if that is a legitimate process that is backed by all the Palestinian people, and if there are ironclad guarantees that the Israelis aren't going to come and attack the next day. So Hamas has done something that no other Arab party has ever done with Israel, which is to demand that Israel and the Palestinians be treated by the same standard of diplomatic legitimacy and political transition or flexibility, that if one person is asked to make concession, the other person has to do the exact same kind of concession. So that's where we are with this plan. It's not going to get anywhere in its present form, because one of the things the Arabs have always done, which they've done with the Arab Peace Plan of 2002, which was, I thought, was historic, they don't know how to push for it and to lobby for it and to get on their planes and go around the world, bring coalitions together, offer incentives. They just don't really know how to do that, and what they really don't know how to do, or at least they haven't done it, is to direct their lobbying to the Israeli people directly. In the final analysis, it's the Israelis who have to make the decisions to coexist in peace, and they have to be presented with these ideas and engaged in some kind of diplomacy, whether it's track 2 quiet or public, it doesn't matter. But it can't be done with the Americans being the main diplomatic actors. So that's where we are with that. But other ideas will come forward, I'm pretty sure.
Well, I'm glad you mentioned the Israeli public at the end of that, Rami. I mean, one thing we do know, according to some of the more recent public opinion polls coming out of Israel, is that actually the vast majority of the Israeli public wanted the government to move on to phase 2 of the agreement, and they wanted to see an end to the war. So the public was giving the government a mandate to do that. But that's not the decision that the government ultimately made. The decision that they made, of course, was to collapse the ceasefire entirely. And even before they did that, they made it clear that they weren't interested in moving to phase 2. They were interested in renegotiating the agreement entirely to effectively extend phase 1, or try to change the terms of phase 1 so that they could get more hostages out without actually having to commit to ending the war on Gaza. And this is really about something that we touched on earlier, which is Israeli domestic politics, and in particular, the political interests of one Benjamin Netanyahu. And I think this is something that is becoming more and more clear even to Israelis over time, that the interests of one man are overriding everything else. And I think, this is a prime minister that, of course, has built his entire career on a resume of being Mr. Security and out securitizing all of his opponents. He's the one that can secure Israel. He's the one that knows how to defeat Israel's enemies, and all of his political opponents don't match his skills in this regard. And yet, this is the prime minister that presided over the single biggest security catastrophe in modern Israeli history. Most people who were involved in the Israeli security and intelligence establishment since October 7th have, put themselves forward for some form of accountability before the Israeli public. They have conducted investigations into their agencies, whether it's the Shin Bet or different parts of the military, to kind of review their failings ahead and during the events of October 7th. And several people have also resigned from their positions. The only person who is putting off any form of accountability for as long as possible is the person sitting on top, which is the Israeli prime minister. And that ultimately is probably shaping more of Israeli government behavior today than ever before. And let's remember, prior to October 7th, Netanyahu was an embattled prime minister to begin with. He was facing a number of different corruption charges, and he ended up putting together the most far-right and extreme coalition in Israeli history, one that took the state of Israel in the direction of civil strife and division, precisely so that he can avoid his day in court. And if he was willing to tear Israeli society apart to keep his rear end out of jail, he sure doesn't care about killing Palestinians if that can help him do the same thing. And anyone who speaks up against Netanyahu, whether on the inside or out, is branded a traitor, a Hamas apologist, an agent of a foreign power, or what have you, and effectively sidelined. We've seen him do that with the head of the Shin Bet. They're doing the same with the attorney general right now, which is leading many Israelis to say that there is an oncoming constitutional crisis in Israel. So the domestic politics in Israel, I think, have a lot to do with why we're back to where we are today. And I wanted to touch on one last piece with all of you, and that's, as we're watching this genocide really restart in high gear now in Gaza, we're also seeing the repression of dissent against this genocide pick up here in the United States, as a number of different activists have been targeted by the henchmen of the American government. There's no other way to put it. We're seeing students being ripped from their families, arrested on the streets by immigration officers, held without charge, disappeared to locations thousands of miles away. And all of this seems blatantly illegal. And yet it continues to happen here in the United States. What do you all make of this crackdown on dissent against Israel's genocide that the Trump administration continues to escalate?
Yousef, this has been a really disturbing development that I'm shocked at the speed of how this has accelerated, deteriorated. I don't even know the word, since Trump was inaugurated. Just before recording this, I was watching a new video of a Turkish PhD student at Tufts who had participated in some pro-Palestine campaigns. I think she wrote an article for the Tufts student newspaper. She was coming home from iftar, carrying her backpack, and just people in masks in unidentified cars just walk up to her, and you can't really hear the audio, and just take her away. It's absolutely shocking to see. I think, many of the people listening probably heard about and saw the video of Mahmoud Khalil, who had a similar story, coming home with his wife. On the one hand, you have to think A movement, any movement, and history has shown us this, that is so dependent on repression and able to move forward is a dying movement. Because if you are not allowing dissent, if you are changing how our very courts work, if you are, have been able to co-opt so many of our systems of immigration and legal systems, et cetera, to be able to do this, that is genuinely a sign of desperation. On the other hand, for the people whose lives are being affected, it's absolutely horrific. Mahmoud Khalil's wife is 8 months pregnant. She's probably due any day now with her husband hundreds or thousands of miles away. It's unclear what will happen to these students. We've had a lot of judges who have put a stay on their actual relocation or deportation, but we don't even know what the court system means in these kinds of cases anymore. It's clear that Trump's immigration officials are kind of doing whatever they want. And it's very frightening, not just for the individuals targeted, but as someone who knows a lot of people in these spaces, people are absolutely terrified, especially non-US citizens, people who even just attended a protest or attended a webinar, people who, donated or interned at UNRWA, people who did things that are otherwise completely anodyne in any normal reality are terrified that they are going to get picked up by ICE at the airport, walking home from school. Brown University actually issued guidance to their non-US citizen faculty and staff to even avoid domestic travel, just so that you're not put in a situation where you're being questioned, detained by immigration officials. So it's not even just the occurrences, it's the chilling effect that it's going to have. Undoubtedly, this is part of it. They want people to think twice before attending a meeting, writing a paper, going to a protest, holding a protest. And then on the other hand, you have the acquiescence of institutions like Columbia, that completely gave in to the Trump administration's demands, humiliatingly, even after they were told that this was no guarantee that they would get the federal funding back that was cut. So on the one hand, you have this repression. On the other, we're seeing all of our institutions folding. Even how media is reporting this is absolutely in line with this kind of Trumpian, well, maybe they did do something wrong, and let's just get all the facts, and well, he shouldn't have been there, and well, if you're in this country, you should love it. It's like, wait, what? So it's a really troubling atmosphere. And while this may be the death rattles of a movement that has seen that it's no longer legitimate, I mean, everyone has seen Gaza in the past 16 months, they can do untold damage as it goes down. And how long will that take? I know a lot of people who are terrified of those answers.
Yeah, if I can jump in here, I just spent 4 days in Dearborn, Michigan, doing some lectures and talking to immigration lawyers, political activists, people involved in legal issues to look into precisely this issue. And my impression is that there's something historic going on here, which is that Gaza, or the Israel-Palestine conflict, is now at the core of American domestic political tensions and contestations. It started with Kamala Harris back in the primaries when the uncommitted movement said they wouldn't vote for the Democrats if they kept their genocide support policies. And this is what happened. Kamala Harris didn't change, and they didn't vote for her. And that was one of the factors why she lost. There were others. So that was a hint that Palestine could impact American domestic politics, including electoral politics at the presidential level. Now what we're seeing is a movement by the Trump folks trying to use the Palestinian issue to silence Palestinian voices as the first step to a wider campaign to silence people dealing with gender issues, climate change, immigration, the role of universities, every dimension of society that the Trump folks don't like. And then the other factor that's so important, I think, is the counter reaction to this, the counter forces. And you're getting people like the United Auto Workers issued a statement, the ACLU, people who are not linked directly to Palestine. So every American now feel, not everyone, but everyone should feel that their fundamental rights, their constitutional rights, as well as their material, practical well-being, quality of their education, the role of their public library, et cetera, their media. All of these are threatened. So this has gone beyond just Palestine to a threat to the American institutions and the American way of life, which has been a good life for many people, not all. And this is really a historic moment. It's not clear if a coalition that's forming among pro-Arab groups, pro-Palestine groups, civil rights groups, women's groups, church groups, labor groups, all these different groups, if they're going to be able to come together in a coordinated movement to push back. But the first signs are that they are, because the first sign is action in the courts. And every step that's taken, a student at Georgetown or Brown is held immediately. There's a court case within a couple of hours, and the judge says, freeze the detention, whatever. These are important signs of change. And hopefully, if there is enough pressure through this mechanism that scares the political people into thinking that, well, they're going to lose votes if they keep doing this, then it's possible, it's a long shot, but it's possible that Republicans and Democrats might say, look, let's end this Gaza situation peacefully and fairly to both sides, pressure the Israelis, and let's move on to better days. I don't expect it to happen soon, but we're seeing unusual things happening now that could be positive things for the cause of justice for all.
I second all of the above. And I would add that I personally am optimistic that eventually this will end and eventually this will be resolved. But there have to be real lessons learned here, finally. For decades, Palestinians and their supporters in the United States tried to warn that these sorts of actions could become inevitable because the infrastructure and the precedent for what Trump is doing right now long predates him by decades and decades. It knows really, it's no political party. It's a bipartisan attitude towards the question of Palestine in the United States. And it has precedents that go back really generations. So during the Nixon administration, every single Arab student in the United States on a student visa was questioned on their views on Palestine, really at the behest of the Israel lobby at the time. And so this happened, and there were deportations that happened as a result of this, the majority of which deported people actually on technicalities, like working while on a student visa and so on. But again, at that moment, Palestinians and their supporters did try to warn what was happening to them, and it fell on deaf ears. A lot of domestic surveillance laws, anti-terrorism laws, violations of civil liberties and constitutional rights, like some would see the Patriot Act as, really had found their precedent in anti-Palestinian laws in the United States. And there's a really important report that I encourage people to check out if this is interesting to you, published by Palestine Legal, written by Darrell Lee, a professor of anthropology and law, that goes into this. It's called Anti-Palestinian at its Core. And this is something that you should check out. There was the litigation of the Holy Land Foundation in the early to mid 2000s, in which convictions and long prison sentences were handed out to leaders of Palestinian American Charity in a court case that was brought actually again at the insistence of Ariel Sharon, and led to convictions. But if you read into the details of the case, civil liberties and precedent and good practice were completely thrown out the window to drive this conviction. While double jeopardy is not allowed, the case was tried twice. Anti-BDS laws had been passed, actually a slew of them under a Democratic president, Barack Obama, but also at the state level, often under Democratic governors. And this is not to excuse the Republicans at all, but I think it's much clearer, it's probably more apparent to people, how Republican leaders have viewed this issue, but so much of this was swept under the rug during that time. And so also the doxing and harassment of students, which led to physical threats, intimidation campaigns, all of this had happened intensely in the last 10 years, let's say. And so much of this already has a precedent and already has an infrastructure there, but now it's affecting such a huge number of people. And like Rami and Yara had already pointed out, that raises some serious questions about the United States as a whole now that it's affecting people beyond this. What I find sort of interesting is that in some right-wing spaces, The fear actually is that what is being done right now, if Trump does not stop, will be weaponized. The infrastructure and the precedent for this will be weaponized by Democrats in the next administrations against them. We hope that better lessons are learned from this, and I think lessons about justice and about constitutional rights and civil liberties and free speech are the lesson here. But it's I think right now we're in murky territory, and so that's all I'll say about this for now.
Yeah, in closing, I just want to know, we began this conversation talking about, among others, Dr. Hussam Abu Safia, who was picked up in Gaza by the Israeli military and held without charge and is still held without charge. And we end this conversation now talking about people who are protesting these horrific policies against Palestinians in Gaza being picked up and held without charge here in the United States. And one has to wonder for how long Americans will tolerate their Constitution being torn to shreds to support the genocide of another people thousands of miles away. I'm not sure that Americans will put up with it for too long, but we'll see. And of course, this is taking place in the context of attacks not just on the civil rights and liberties of those advocating for Palestine here in the United States. We've seen immigrants from other countries also have their rights effectively suspended, being sent to prison camps in third countries, and so on. And there is a clear deterioration of rights and values that Americans used to think set them apart from many other parts of the world. So it seems like at some point, a reality check will have to happen. That'll conclude our conversation for today. Thank you all, as always, for joining me. And we'll leave the rest of the questions for another day.